Today's video is sponsored by RAVPower. Happy birthday to Switch, happy birthday to Switch. I know we're a little late, but let's celebrate anyways. I originally sang that version of the song, but then I remembered that it's copyrighted. Thanks, YouTube. Earlier this week, the Switch had its 3rd birthday, and I gotta say, looking back on the past year, it was a pretty good year. On the one hand, I don't think the Switch necessarily had a singular huge game release like you could look at for, say, Breath of the Wild or Super Mario Odyssey, but there were a lot of great titles that came out over this time, not to mention some pretty big milestones for hardware releases. In fact, to start with, let's go ahead and talk about hardware. So, over the course of last year, Nintendo released 2 new versions of the Switch. We got the revised regular model of the Switch and the more noticeably different Switch Lite. Of the 2, I think the revised Switch was actually the bigger surprise, because for a while now, people have talked about the concept of a Switch Pro or Nintendo releasing some kind of more powerful model of the Switch, and that's what we were all kind of hoping to maybe see, and instead we got a better version of the regular model, and it is definitely better. It was priced at the same, it was a very quiet refresh in that they just kind of lightly announced it and then put it in a slightly different looking box that was red instead of white, but it did come with a very important improvement in that it was just a much more power efficient Switch. The obvious upside of that being the fact that it gave us a much better battery life than the original launch model, which was, I think, one of the chief complaints a few people had, especially those of us that like playing in handheld primarily. But the added benefit of this on top of that is because it was more energy efficient, it also ran a lot cooler compared to the original Switch, which, given the kind of damage some people were seeing over time with cracks in the plastic, especially playing in docked a lot, the kind of heat buildup the system would get, having that more energy efficient model is giving us a lot of hopes that those new models aren't going to have that problem, which personally I haven't had any yet, but time will still tell. The Switch Lite, on the other hand, was met with a little more mixed reception, mostly in the form of people that were hoping for a Switch Pro, just really angry at the fact that we got basically the exact opposite of that system, but also people who are really excited about the concept of a handheld dedicated version. But really, even for both of those camps, one thing that still holds very true to the system is really heavy confusion of the fact that it just doesn't support HDMI out at all. I mean, again, one of the main things that makes a Switch in name is that it can go between docked and regular handheld gameplay, and the Switch Lite not being able to do that at all is kind of a weird sell to a lot of people. And in some cases, it works out perfectly fine. Honestly, I basically always play handheld except for a couple of games, and I think it's a great choice for kids, but at the end of the day, that's just a really weird concept to a lot of people, and it shows, because while the Switch Lite has sold fine, it's not doing anywhere near the numbers that Nintendo was hoping for, even with their own sales call mentioning the fact that, yeah, it's doing okay, but how do we convince people to actually go out and buy more of them? And part of that might be playing out right now with more colors coming out soon, like the coral pink design. Before moving on, I want to take a second to thank RAVPower for sponsoring today's video. With their line of portable PD Pioneer battery banks, you can make sure you always have enough power on the go so you're never stranded with dead devices, especially with their 20,000 milliamp hour model that comes with 60 watt-hour charging. With this much power, you can charge an iPhone 11 Pro Max 2.5 times over, and with 60 watt out, it can keep up with the most power-hungry devices, including a MacBook Pro. Plus, on top of that, thanks to having a 30 watt input, you can charge up the full battery bank in just 2.5 hours. And if you're not looking for something quite so much of a powerhouse, they've got plenty of great, more affordable options as well, including this 15,000 milliamp hour option that comes with 18 watt out, so you can make sure you can charge all your regular on-the-go devices whenever you need to. Check out the links down below for more info, and now back to our regularly scheduled Switch content. With both of these systems coming out last year, combined with Nintendo's own statements during their sales call that we aren't getting any new system anytime in 2020, signs to point to the fact that if we are getting some kind of Switch Pro, it's not going to be anytime super soon. And really, when you look at the overall trajectory of systems, if that were to happen, it might actually be sometime in 2021. I mean, you have the original Switch coming out in 2017, 2 years later in 2019, you get a Switch Lite as well as a slightly better regular Switch. So in 2021, we could be seeing maybe a Switch Pro launched alongside a revised Switch Lite, another revised regular Switch, or maybe even just a Switch Pro on its own. Who knows? We'll find out. Hardware is cool and all, but one of the really big things I want to emphasize about this past year has been the game releases. Like I said, we didn't necessarily have a full equivalent to the success of Breath of the Wild or Super Mario Odyssey, but Nintendo released a lot of amazing games, and a lot of them are still selling really well. As far as just kind of the big name stuff goes, we got a new Zelda in the form of a remake for Link's Awakening, which had a couple performance issues overall, but at the end was still a faithful reinterpretation that, not to mention, looked super cute. We got a new Pokemon game, which a lot of people have very different opinions about, but at the end of the day is selling really, really well for Nintendo. We got Mario Maker 2, which finally brought a great formula from the Wii U and 3DS over to the Switch, while missing a couple features some people liked, added a whole lot of new stuff that is super fun. And we got Luigi's Mansion 3, which I think, surprising a lot of people, is one of the best looking games on the Switch to date. Personally, the biggest one for me was definitely Fire Emblem Three Houses. I'm a big RPG fan, so that just makes sense. And while it is kind of a slightly weird remix of the franchise, where it's a little less about war and a little more about high school, at least initially, I really like the way they pulled it off, and it's definitely one of the most replayable games in the franchise, having 4 different endings. I think one of the biggest surprises of this last year, though, isn't a first-party exclusive from Nintendo, but instead an exclusive title coming from what is now starting to be one of their most trusted third-party partners, Platinum's Astral Chain, which, while I think a lot of people were curious about it going into it, ended up finding to be one of the best action games on the Switch, and sold a lot more than I think anyone was really anticipating. And while those are all sort of the really big games that I think a lot of people like to talk about, there are way more that came out that are still really, really good and worth playing. Games like Yoshi's Crafted World, Cadence of Hyrule, which I don't think anyone saw that indie crossover happening, which was amazing. Yokai Watch 4, Marvel's Alliance 3, which was an okay sequel, got the job done. Daemon Ex Machina, which a lot of people forgot about right away. Little Town Hero, which people forgot about even faster. And of course, Ring Fit Adventure, which I think is actually one of the most successful ventures Nintendo has had so far of making a more physical game to come out for the Switch. Labo was an interesting experiment, and I think it's fun for kids, but Ring Fit actually is a pretty good exercise regimen, and I think stacks up really well, especially compared to Nintendo's past efforts with things like the Wii. We also finally got a Persona game. Kind of, finally, in Japan, and it's a Dynasty Warriors spin-off. But if it sells really well, we might get it here, and maybe Persona 5 on the Switch, which just makes sense, and I don't know why it hasn't happened yet. And that's just talking about exclusive titles that came out on the Switch. There's a lot more, including multi-platform games that are indie titles, or even just big hit games, and ports. So many ports. I don't have time to list every single game that made their way to the Switch this past year, but I think worth especially noting is a number of games that hit a level of performance that we didn't think the Switch was capable of, with things like Witcher 3 and Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, or games that we would have traditionally associated with being console exclusive, like Cuphead and Ori the Blind Forest, which you would have thought would have stayed on just Xbox and PC forever, but no, they're on the Switch now, and honestly, they fit really well on that platform. The thing is, with how many great games came out on the Switch last year, the year ahead has a few people a little worried. Not that there's not going to be any great games whatsoever, but currently we're at kind of a weird moment where we finally got all these games coming out, and as we stand right now, there's not too much directly on the horizon. I didn't intend that pun, but the only game that we know for sure right now is later this month. We are, of course, getting Animal Crossing New Horizons, which people are super excited for, but past that, it's kind of one gigantic question mark right now. We haven't had a Nintendo Direct in a while, at least a more general one focused on talking about multiple games, and while there have been a lot of games announced just kind of in the broad spectrum of, hey, these are coming out eventually at some time, we don't really have release dates for a lot of them. I mean, really, going as far back as when the Switch first came out, there are a lot of games that we kind of know about that are happening, but we still don't know when exactly they are happening. Just to list off some of the biggest ones that have been announced over the last 3 years, we've got games like Bayonetta 3, Metroid Prime 4, Shin Megami Tensei 5, which again was announced way back when the Switch was first revealed, and a number of games that have been announced a little more recently, but we still don't know exactly what's happening, like No More Heroes 3, Bravely Default 2, Axiom Verge 2, the Xenoblade Remake, and of course, Breath of the Wild 2. That one in particular is the one that I think a lot of people are really stressing about right now and just want a better idea of when it's happening. I think there are a lot of hopes that's coming out this year, and personally, I'm not completely convinced. Just when you look at the history of when new Zelda games have been announced, especially the big ones, the timing just feels a little too soon for me. I honestly do think that one's going to be more like a 2021 release, but because it is a little more closely tied to a game that's already been released with Breath of the Wild, it could be this year. I don't want to completely dash out the hopes of that. It's just, me personally, I'm a little more skeptical. I know some people are taking this info and the kind of current uncertainty of what games are coming out when as a bad sign, especially considering the fact that this is the year we are getting new systems from both Xbox and PlayStation. I'm personally not really all that worried though. The Switch has been selling very, very well, especially this past year, and I think it's going to continue to do well. And while we may not know what exactly is coming out in the next 6 months or even the next rest of the year, we know a number of big name titles that we're waiting on, and Nintendo is working on them. We just don't know anything yet. Even if we don't get a new Nintendo Direct until next week, next month, or the next 3 months, I feel confident that Nintendo is working on enough titles and is going to announce stuff that we're going to have some great games. And even if it is a relatively slow year compared to the past 3, I feel like they're still going to have some great stuff worth playing. That's at least how I feel about the next year. I really think this last one was strong, and the momentum is going to continue on into 2020 and early 2021, but let me know what you guys think down below in the comments. What were your favorite games of the last year? Did you pick up one of the new systems? And what are you hoping to see this coming year?